Hello, everybody. This is going to be our fourth lecture, finishing off chapter 6 uh, for archaeology. Um, we have two more lectures in this particular section, and then we'll be good to go. So let's get into some of the stuff. Actually, you know what? Hold on. Sorry. Um, Real quickly, make sure to check announcements. I know I say this all the time, but some people still don't seem to check them. Make sure to read my emails because they have important information. I only send you an email like once a week unless it's like an emergency. So just please take like the whatever 30 seconds it is to read them because they have important information. All right, so please keep that in mind. All right, so let's think about this particular question. Think about 5,000 years in the future. What is something that archaeologists would find from 2020, and what conclusions would they make about what they found, right? So if you think about, if I give you a scenario, right? Let's say that it's, year 3000 and all humans on Earth have been extinguished by some kind of natural disaster, right? But we all died in 2020 or like June of 2020. Now, what types of things would we find there? And what would you think they were, right? And notice I used the year 2020 in particular because that was the year COVID hit and we shut down for a while, right? I want to think about what we would find, and then we'll talk about kind of like some of the things or what that would mean and some of the challenges of understanding what actually went down in 2020 as an archaeologist. Okay. So let's get into some other stuff first. Interpreting subsistence strategies. So subsistence strategies are basically just different ways that different societies use to survive, right? So subsistence is to live, and strategies are like ways to live. So, meeting basic survival needs such as finding water, finding food, building shelter, so on and so forth. Okay. Archaeologists divide these societies into both foraging societies and food producing societies. Foragers are food collectors who gather fish or hunt. Basically, they do not produce their own food, and food producers depend on domesticated plants or animals or both, meaning they have some way of producing their own food. In this case, it's domestication, right? Or farming, or, well, it's not always farming. That's why they don't use that word, but they have a way of producing their own food. Okay. The food producers include pastoralists who herd animals, okay, and also farmers who practice intensive or extensive agriculture, okay. Now, real quickly, you might be asking what's intensive or extensive. I'll explain that in the next slide. But one thing I want you to be careful of, right, is the understanding that these are two very like kind of like polar opposites. A lot of especially our ancestors, do not live in polar opposites. So there were a lot of societies that were mostly food producing or mostly foraging, but they still had a lot of the other aspect of obtaining food. So let me give you an example. If we went to, and I'm sure this happens today, if we went to like a steakhouse and they had freshly foraged mushrooms, right? Meaning they found these mushrooms in the wild. Does that make us foragers? No, right? So it really depends on how much of your diet is forage or how much of your diet is food produced, and that will determine whether your society is a food producer society or a foraging society. It's pretty straightforward, but you have to keep that in mind, right? Remember, in our past, right, when we produce food with things like farming and herding and stuff like that, we have very sophisticated ways of doing it now because we've done it for a long time, but with our ancestors, they weren't as aware of how to do these things when it first started. So it's no surprise that if certain societies were to start producing their own food, it wouldn't be perfect the first few years, obviously. And so a lot of their food would still have to come from foraging, right? So it could be like, 35 food produce and then 65% forage, and then it gets less and less as their food production gets better. But just keep that in mind that sometimes it's somewhere in between these polar opposites. Okay. So this is a nice little graph of subsistence strategies. Food collectors, which are foragers, is pretty straightforward. There are small scale foragers and complex foragers. Small scale foragers, you can think of them as more rudimentary or more fundamental in their strategies of foraging food, meaning that they're a little less sophisticated in their in their strategies, right? Like, hey, there's a blueberry there, let's eat the blueberry, or hey, there's something there, let's get it. Complex foragers are a little more intelligent about the way they do it, right? Maybe they know like, okay, right now it's not blueberry season, we should let them grow in, or hey, right now there's a lot of fruits and vegetables out there, let's collect all of them and, I don't know, like whatever. It's just a more intelligent, more strategic way of foraging for food. Okay. Now, on the other side of this is food producers. There are herders and farmers. Herders, again, pretty straightforward. They just herd animals and then use them as they see fit. And farmers, as we talked about earlier, there's extensive and intensive agriculture, right? So extensive and intensive. Why do they have those words there? Extensive is referring to the ability of farmers to reach a certain amount of people with their food, right? Why is that important? If I throw an avocado, I'm sure you guys have done this in like science class, right? If you throw an avocado seed into a bunch of dirt or a cup of water, does that make me a farmer? No, right? That's why extensive is important. It's because it's feeding people, okay? Or multiple people, not just one person even. Intensive agriculture. This was referring more to the understanding and the strategy behind the way that people farm, right? So I personally, I know most of us are, city folks, so we don't really know this, but there are certain times that you want to plant certain things. There are certain places where certain things grow better. You have to make sure that it has enough shade, like all these like kind of important strategic um understandings of how things grow is really important. And then that refers to intensive. And finally, what we are in today, which is a mechanized industrial agriculture, which is basically a mass-produced version of farming. A lot of people have a lot of negative things to say about this. And I agree to most of to what most of the people say, but we also have to understand that there's a lot of benefits to having mechanized industrial agriculture, right? There are just a lot of also bad things that come with it. But we'll talk about that later. Okay. So this is kind of the subsistence strategies of our ancestors. So now we're going to talk a little bit about social organization. Okay. Societies are sometimes categorized into bands, tribes, chiefs, and states. These represent points on a continuum. Now, one thing I want you to do before we get into this, right, is I want you to separate your understanding of these words with the words that we're actually using, right? The definition of these things in archaeology are going to be different than the definitions that probably you're familiar with, right? When I say the word bands, for example, you're probably going to think of music bands, which is not actually a terrible comparison, but it's a bad comparison because a band usually has 4 or 5 people, but in terms of archaeological bands, they have like 50, right? So it's like a different measure. Tribes and chiefdoms, right? And states, these are all also words that have different meanings. Tribes, it refers, like a lot of people think of Native American tribes, which is sometimes not wrong, but you have to understand that the tribes definition means something different. And then the other big one is states, right? States, obviously, when we use the word states, we're referring to like a place within a country, like a state, like a province type of thing. But in archaeology, it means something different. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this. Band societies. Band societies are the common social organization among foragers. Consists usually of no more than 50 people, provide roughly equal access to material social valuables, are egalitarian, and divide labor on the basis of age and sex. So there's a couple, these are kind of the highlights, right? Band societies, they're usually foragers, right? They're usually people that do not know how to produce their own food. They usually are pretty small with about 50 people. And what's interesting is they usually have roughly equal access to material social valuables, right? So what that means is basically if there's 50 people in a band, right, and you give and you find 50 fish, each person gets a fish, no matter if they helped you fish, no matter if they hunted or did nothing or did everything, doesn't matter. Everyone gets a fish. We're going to talk about why that's important when we hit chiefdoms. Okay. And then finally, how do they divide up the work that is needed for their society is based off of age and sex, basically how old you are and whether you're male or female. Okay. Now, tribal societies. Tribal societies are composed of farmers or herders. So now we are starting to have a little more control of our food source. They consist usually of more people than seen in a band. So let's double. Let's say it's 100 people. They provide roughly equal access to material social values. This is still interesting. They're still egalitarian. 100 people, 100 fish, everyone gets a fish, right? It doesn't like doesn't divide up in a different way. And a tribal society, they may divide labor on the basis of modalities that group people based on age, sex, economic role, or personal interest. This is important. It means that they are dividing labor on different criteria now, right? Aside from how old you are, whether you're male or female, they're also thinking about, okay, what's your role in the society? What type of interest do you have? So now if Lucy really likes to hunt deer, they're gonna be like, all right, Lucy, you don't have to do you don't have to fish. You can go and hunt deer with the rest of them more often, right? And that's how they divide the labor now. It's more based off of not just, hey, you're this old and you're a male, or this you're old and you're a female. This is also now based off of interest. Very different. And finally, can have a leader with greater prestige, but not usually greater power or wealth. This is also very interesting. So tribal societies tend to have a leader and they have greater prestige. I mean, they have a lot of respect, but they don't usually have greater power or wealth. Now, what does that look like? So let's say I am a member of a tribe, and our tribe leader, John, is like, "Yo, hey," I'm like, "Hey, I want to go out hunting. It's raining outside, but I still think it's good to hunt." And then John's like, "Yo, like, don't go out hunting. It's bad. People have died before. Like, whatever, right?" He gives me a good rap. Now, in tribal societies, remember, they have more respect. So I'm gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna really seriously consider what John says, but at the same time, I am wait, hold up. Is this not playing? Hold on, hold on, hold on. Is it working? Why is it not working? Is it working? Yeah, it's working. Okay. So by the same time, right, I don't have to listen to John. I can not listen to John and be okay, right? That is very different in a different society that's like a state, because John is going to be like, yo, like if you don't listen to me, I'm going to freaking, I don't know, call the military on you, right? Whatever. But the main point is that the leader has more respect, obviously, because they're the leader. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to respect what John tells me. I'm going to seriously consider it. But at the same time, I don't have to listen to John. Okay. So this is a tribal society. Okay. Now, you might assume that, oh, hey, like don't tribes then mostly fit? Sorry, most Native American tribes mostly fit in this category. That's not true, actually. A lot of tribes are actually chiefdoms or states. But it's just a word that we use. So just keep that in mind. All right, chieftain societies. So chieftain societies usually consist of more people than seen in a tribe. So let's say 150, 200 people. They provide roughly unequal access to materials which are valuable. So now at this point, there are different. Well, actually, we'll go on to the next point. Then I'll explain what I mean. They have a leader or chief who, along with his or her relatives, have privileged access to power, wealth, and prestige. They show a greater degree of craft production, and they finally may develop into states. So this is very interesting. Let's talk about the show a greater degree of craft production. So this means that, what does craft production mean? It means that whatever they're making, it could be a pot, a pan, it could be clothes, it could be whatever it is higher level now. It's not just like a piece of metal or sorry, a piece of wood that they, kind of scrape out. Now things are, the bowls are more round, the knives are sharper, whatever, right? Like there's a higher degree of craft production. Okay. Now, which is very interesting. Now they have a leader that has more access to power, wealth, and prestige, right? And also, this is related to having unequal access to material or social valuables. So, what does that mean? That means that let's say we're a group of 200 people, they catch 200 fish. So and so is or John is the leader of our society, and so John is going to get 10 fish. Jane is didn't do anything to keep this fish, you get zero fish, right? And so there's already at this point some unequal access to the resources that are within our society. Now, what's interesting about the leader here is that now they are starting to have different access to power, wealth, and prestige, right? So prestige is already there in tribes, right? They're the leader, they get respect. But now they have power and wealth, right? Now they can tell me like, yo, like if I'm like, hey, John, I want to go hunting, John can be like, no, if you go hunting, I'm gonna have my, my whatever, my enforcer here put you in jail or whatever. Now things are different, right? When people hear the word unequal access to material, they always think it's negative, but it's not. It's just a different way of handling a society. Okay. So now different people have different access to things, and when they share the resources, it's not as similar as it was in tribes. Okay. Now the last one, states. So states consist of a stratified society with unequal access to material social valuables. They have a defined territory and a centralized government. Those are very important. Are led by an elite with the power to tax and a monopoly using force, and finally may develop into empires by conquering other states. Okay, so real quickly, what a stratified society is a society that has a lot of categories. That's pretty much it. And those different categories have different access to resources. Okay. So in our society, it's very easy because our society is like, if you're categorized as, I don't know, uh, middle income versus low income, you have a different tax bracket. That's a pretty clear indicator, right? There's a lot of other categories, but that's a clear indicator in terms of money, right? If you've I don't know, if you're a director versus a associate, the director has more money. It gets more money. They have different access to different things. It doesn't matter. The main point is that there's a lot of different categories, and because you're in a certain category, you have different access to resources. Easy example is like if you ever played those medieval games, right? Or like read those medieval books. There's like the king, the queen, the royalty, the knights, the merchants, the peasants, right? Those are different categories. They all have different access to material and social valuables because of where they are in that category. That is an example of a stratified society. Okay. Now, you have defined territory and centralized government. That's pretty straightforward, right? The other versions or the other societies do not have a centralized government or territory and are led with the power to tax and a monopoly on using force. That is very clear indicator, right? So, it doesn't have to be the exact person, right? But it could be an elite group, right? So if you're part of a kingdom and the king might have a council that decides like how much to tax or how little to tax. That's an example. And a monopoly using force, right? The king can, I don't know, call the knights and be like, yo, deal with this dude. This dude is like, breaking into the castle, but the dude that's breaking into the castle can't call the knights to kill or to deal with the king. That is an example of having a monopoly using force, meaning they have the ability to utilize some version of a state of a government, whatever. I'm trying to use words that don't because using force could mean a lot of different things, but like in its easiest example, it's like, can Trump raise my taxes? Like not directly. He has his own like council people. Yes, right? Can I raise taxes on Trump? No. Then he's the lead with power. If we really needed to, can Trump call like the freaking, SEAL Team 6 on me? Absolutely. Can I call SEAL Team 6 on Trump? Absolutely not, right? That is the monopoly on using force, meaning that the leader can use force that the normies can't use. Okay. And finally, states may develop into empires by conquering other states. Okay. So now one of the things that I wanted to emphasize here, right, and this is on the quiz, is chieftain societies may develop into states. If you notice, the rest of these little slides don't have that on their description. And the reason why is very simple, okay? It is because by the time they reach a chieftain society, they usually have a pretty good idea of how to survive, okay? And more importantly, when you are abandoned in a tribe society, it is a very rough life. There's a lot of ways you can die. That's really ultimately what it comes down to. Let's say you're a tribal society and all of your animals that you've been taking care of get sick. Well, you're screwed. What if you're a tribal society and you make a mistake farming and then you have no crops for the season? You're done. What if you go hunting and you guys eat something and someone gets sick and everyone gets sick? Not even someone the person that's supposed to help you fish gets sick and they die. Then you have no fish and then you guys are all dead, right? So there's a lot of ways in which from advanced society, tribe society, and tribe society to chief society, those three, like, they just die all the time. Okay. Like there's just a lot of random things that happen. It is right now because we've obviously taken control of a lot of the world and our circumstances, we don't die in these ways very often, right? Like God forbid, like at that time, like you catch a flu, like 500 years ago, woo, son, you are done for. You know what I mean? Or what if there's like a random animal with venom that bites you? You're gone. Today, no problem. Just rush you to the hospital. You're good to go. You know what I mean? But again, just keep in mind that the reason why chieftain societies can turn to state societies because more or less they have a lot of the survival stuff kind of figured out. If they're that big, they kind of have a lot of the stuff figured out, whatever that stuff might be. At this point, at band and tribe societies, it's just so easy to die. That's essentially why they do not have that one little line on the bottom saying that, oh, this may develop into the next level. Okay, very good. So, digital heritage, this is not super important, but it is important to just like hear. Digital heritage refers to digital information about the past available on the internet. Digital information includes digitized documents, photos, artifact images, video and sound recordings, 3D artifacts, and reconstructions. Now, this sounds like whatever to you, but you have to understand that before the internet was here, it was a very, very difficult um, area to share information with. Imagine if, let's say, I do a lot of research in Miami, Florida on the native group that lives there. And there's another person in Atlanta that does, or no, I mean, that's too close. That's in Texas that does a lot of that wants to see my research. This dude needs to fly all the way to freaking Miami just to see my research. And now, because everything's online, it's much easier to share things back and forth. So the information on the internet in general has, and then the use of computers has really improved the accessibility of archaeological information all across the board. So, same thing. The potential of connecting data to spatial coordinates, fleshing out site and landscape, and rendering simulated past and photogenic graphic detail, all the scale world building as complete a model of the past as possible, digital heritage. This is research. Okay, so basically, what this one is also saying, right, is I'm talking about information sharing. There's also a lot of world building. So if you guys have ever played like Minecraft or like Sims or whatever, that technology can go into creating a mini world that we believe happened 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago. And it's a much better way to get it done and share information because things, how should I say this? Because, if you think about, again, like 50 years ago, everyone had to freaking use like little stick figures and models. But guess what? What if another archaeologist finds something new and your whole theory gets thrown out the door? That means that you wasted all this freaking time and all these resources creating little stick figures instead but then now because we have computers you can kind of create like an online Sims thing and so it's like when you have to replace things it's not as dramatic. You don't have to like throw away like 5 weeks of work. Okay, all right, now let's talk about some ethics. Okay, archaeologists recognize now that the past can have meaning to people living today. Descending communities help deepen and understand the past, and conflicts have developed over ownership of the past, especially over excavation of Native American burials. So the reason why we have an ethics part in this is because, quite frankly, archaeologists abused, or sorry, the archaeologists were ethically being jerks to a lot of people, specifically to Native Americans. That's why we have this whole section in here. And basically what would happen is like, archaeologists be like, hey, I want to dig up your great great grandmother. And then the tribe's like, no. Or like, or the tribe's like, hey, what are you going to give us? And archaeologists like, probably nothing. And probably tribe's like, oh, then no. And archaeologists like, oh, I'm going to do it anyway. And there was nothing to punish them, to penalize them. And there was nothing to really protect Native Americans in that particular situation. And so that's why NAGPRA was born. Okay, Native Americans Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. Congress passed NAGPRA in 1990 to protect Native American graves on federal or tribal land, which is basically all land. Federal agencies or federally funded museums, which are basically all museums, must also inventory Native American human remains and cultural objects collected in past years. Items may be repatriated or returned to Native American groups if requested. So there's a couple things there, right? And also this passed in 1990. It's not that long ago, but let's talk about the federal agencies one. So you might ask yourself, like, why does an inventory really help, right? The reason why is because when you keep an inventory of your stuff, you can't just be like, oh, hey, I don't know where I got this Native American basket from. I just got it from this dude named John, and I tried calling him, he's not around anymore. No, they are responsible for having that item. And if they cannot basically justify it being in their museum, then they are penalized by the federal government, and they could like lead to the whole shutdown of the whole freaking thing. Okay, and finally, things. So you might think that like, oh, everything's all good now. No, it's not. If you go across, America and a bunch of museums, there are still a lot of stolen Native American everything, artifacts and items, whatever. And so a lot of times when Native American people might, come to New York, let's say, and go to visit the Natural History Museum, they see something, they're like, yo, isn't that a Cherokee like, whatever basket? Does our chief like know about it? They might shoot an email, be like, yo, like, hey, we realize that there's this thing on display at your museum. We would like it back. And then that's how it goes, right? um yeah, because ultimately these museums are benefiting off of the Native American artifacts that they find or whatever, and they're not giving the Native American groups that are still around today any kind of anything, like no money, no nothing. So that's NAGPRA. Okay, so I don't love this example, but it's still important to talk about. So addition to the past, whose past is it anyway? The example they have in the textbook are extremists destroying monuments, as the Taliban did to the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. Let me give you a good general example. So, or sorry, let me give you some context for this. So basically, there was a Buddhist group. Buddhism was pretty popular in Afghanistan during some point in our history, and there's like no record of them being Buddhist there, except the Bamiyan Buddhas, and they did these two massive Buddha statues in Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban blew them up, and it was a big loss for archaeology. And so, it brings up the debate, right? Like, was that right or wrong, right? And obviously, you look at it from our perspective. Of course, it's wrong, but you have to also understand it. It feels a little like it's not ours anyway, so like who are we to say whether it's right or wrong? The Taliban may have been using the Buddhas to express a certain political opinion that wouldn't be heard otherwise. In that case, is it right or wrong? Like if they didn't blow up the Buddhas, would anyone be listening to them? Who knows, right? So it's hard to say. Like, of course, from an archaeological perspective, it's a big loss. But you also have to ask yourself, it's not ours. So what right do we have to say about, this type of stuff anyway? But number two, it's a matter of different values, right? If you can help 10 families by blowing up the Buddhas, is that worth blowing up the Buddhas? That's up to you to decide, right? But it's not a clean cut answer. Ultimately, I usually side on, I tend to lean towards, um, I don't believe certain countries should tell other countries what to do with their stuff. That's kind of my take on it. But that being said, it is still a great loss to lose those Buddhas. So again, it's a debate that you kind of have, for yourself. But also this is important because it really talks about the opposite of preservation, right? What types of things destroy archaeological records, right? Of course, over here, in terms of sometimes political disarray or extremists, they like to call them in the textbook. But there's also land development, right? Like very simply, like just having a Walmart, destroys site through construction, right? But also, two people don't think about usually is mechanized agriculture. If you've ever seen those advertisements for farms where they have that little like spinny thing in the ground, you think the archaeological record, whatever's in there, is going to survive after like getting spun up like that? Never. Okay. And of course, we talked about this earlier, looting in a market for stolen antiquities. If there's a pyramid, and you find like a tomb, or sorry, if there you go as an archaeologist, you go to the pyramids, you find a beautiful tomb for someone that was obviously in the royal family. That's a lot of gold, a lot of jewels. You're an architect. I'm sorry, you're an archaeologist. Are you an archaeologist? You cannot hire, SEAL Team 6 to protect your stuff. But guess what? Those rich billionaires, millionaires can hire SEAL Team 6 to steal it. So, once they steal the stuff, it's kind of like There's nothing left to really research, especially, or there's a lot of stuff that's lost to research because, it's just not there anymore. That's a big thing as well. Okay, so we kind of already talked about this last one, but it's just something that I want to touch on again. So, archaeology now, gender archaeology recognizes that traditional archaeologists often ignore the presence of women in the past. Collaborative archaeology projects seek to study the past by working with descendant communities. Archaeology as a tool of civic engagement is an approach that seeks to use an understanding of the past to address modern social justice issues. So, this is interesting. This is also here because, aside from screwing over natives, they also were pretty discriminatory towards women. Um, and it's a crappy situation. So, this is very interesting, though. Feminist archaeology rejected biological determinism of sex roles, arguing that cultural and historical factors were responsible for how a society allocated tasks and that this allocation could change over time. The goal was to develop a view of the past that replaces the focus on remains with a focus on people as active social agents. So that's not like a hoopla, but basically what it comes down to is it's asking you, like, think about even today. Is the standards for being a man or woman the same today as they were 20 years ago? No. 50 years ago, even less so. So what makes you think that, 500 years in the past, these people have the exact same understanding of man, woman, or male and female? What makes you think that they are paying attention to it and defining it the same way we do? They don't. They probably don't, right? And so to assume certain things is incorrect, and it's no surprise because during the time where they were doing these analysis, it wasn't exactly the most, unsexist of times. It was a pretty sexist time. So it's no surprise that that sexism leads to their analysis as well, right? And remember, keep in mind, this is not changing the facts, so to speak, right? The thing that they found an arrowhead, they found a pot, a pan, a basket, or whatever. Those things are still there. What really changes is the interpretation of what's going on. So let me give you an example, and I'm gonna read the example, and then of course I'm gonna explain it. Geo showed how traditional archaeological discussion of stone tool technologies focused on highly formalized, elaborately retouched, standardized core tools. They're focused together with the assumption that such tools were made by men to hunt with, turns men and their activities into the driving force of cultural evolution. It simultaneously downplays or ignores the far more numerous flake tools that were probably made and used by women in such tasks as processing food or working wood and leather, exposing as false the supposition that women are not strong or smart enough to produce them. So, again, this is a lot of technical words, but basically what's happening here is that in the past, I mean, like, like whatever, like 30, 40 years ago, when people talked about tools, they always emphasize these core tools, right? Basically the tools that men used. And because they emphasize it so much, they talk about hunting and what they did with the tools, that it talks about it, and people assume that it's like a very, very important part of our of our cultural evolution, which is not completely wrong, but because of the massive emphasis of these core tools, it downplays the contribution of women in that particular period. Not only did they contribute, they made their own tools. They made flake tools. They made they made specifically flake tools, which was used for food, wood, and leather. And aside from saying that it's a little bit BS that to say that to suggest that women were not strong or smart enough to produce tools, but it also goes to pose the question, right? People always assume that men hunting is this big deal, but who is providing more of the food? Is it men or women? Because if you look at that, especially at that time, hunting, I don't know if you guys have seen hunting movies and stuff. Hunting's not freaking easy, right? And it's not easy to do with a gun, let alone with a freaking spear. So you have to ask yourself, if women are collecting, all the fruits and vegetables and stuff, who is responsible for most of the diet? Is it women? I mean, the question is unknown, but is it woman? Because if that's the case, that question hasn't even remotely been broached, right? But it's because everyone's so focused on men with their hunting and their core tools, which is important. But what about the woman in the situation? They obviously played a big role in our development as a people overall. Okay, so that's an example, right? And it's not, again, this is a very good example because it's not talking about changing the facts. It's more about changing the interpretation and the focus because people are so focused on men hunting deer or whatever it is that they're not focusing on other parts because, women were not really were not emphasized in this particular case. Okay. So full circle, right? What will we find from 2020, right? To be honest with you, we would find mostly the same stuff as you would in 2018, right? The only difference is you might find what? COVID tests. You might find some COVID like posters. You might find some COVID vaccines. But I want you to ask yourself, if you find this 500 years, 1,000 years in the future, are you going to know that those are COVID tests? How will you know that COVID so seriously impacted our society? Right? So, and also too, like, again, like, what if, there's a lot of jokes about this, but like the pregnancy test really looks like a COVID test, right? Or the COVID test looks like a pregnancy test. Now, if a bunch of people that don't know what happened here found those tests, they might assume they're the same, right? How will they know that COVID was even a thing? Are there real differences in the way that they at least package the vaccine compared to other vaccines? Not really. Okay. So realistically, basically what I'm trying to suggest here is that 2020 was a pretty significant year in our human history because the COVID forced us to stay inside, governments were scrambling. A lot of stuff happened in 2020. If you're an archaeologist, would you ever be able to know about that? What evidence is there that that thing happened? Right? And that's the challenge right there. Is that significant stuff may have occurred, but we really don't know because we weren't there. And unless there is physical evidence of it occurring, we're not going to know how significant the impact was on our society. Okay. And so that's kind of like the challenge of using archaeology to try and understand how our ancestors lived. All right. All right, guys. That's pretty much it. Remember to keep an eye out on the announcements. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kbcc.cuny.edu.